I thank you for coming, especially tonight, because we are in such exhilarating times. And I thought that a real good analogy of what I've been thinking over the last couple weeks is Plato's cave. Did you read Plato's Republic when you were in college? And did you read the analogy of the cave where Socrates explains that people who are not involved in philosophy, who are not thinking about the great questions, who are not trying to learn about the truth of things, are like people who live in a cave and have lived there all their lives, and they have their backs to the light and they watch shadows on the wall. And they have names for the various shadows on the wall, and they are very involved with the shadows. And then he likens learning philosophy to coming out of the cave into the bright sunlight. And you can suddenly see the reality of the things behind the shadows. And he says that there are some people who prefer the cave and the shadows. Well, what we have been living in since January 20th is Plato's cave and the emergence from it. I was asked on the way over here, how do you feel since January 20th? And I said, every day is Christmas. Something else happens that's wonderful. That is, it's so extraordinary, I can't believe it. After 8 years, even I had gotten used to the idea. There's nothing we can do, or at very least, nothing is going to be done. And we're all just going to slide down into destruction and defeat. And now suddenly, there's this huge pushback. But we do see there are a great many people who prefer the cave and the shadows to the reality of things. And so this is not going to be easy. But imagine if Hillary Clinton had been president right now, and we would just be continuing on that same apparently inexorable slide to the dissolution of Judeo-Christian civilization, to the destruction of the United States, and to the extinguishing of free societies in the world for an unknowable period. And now there's hope. I can barely see for the bright sunlight. And I love it. I hope you do too, and are not longing for the cave in the shadows. But if you are, we do have security men here tonight. So, I've been asked to speak about a couple of ways in which this is playing out. And in one of them, in the first one, it's really rather inconclusive as to how and when we're going to see the reality of things. It's only that we have been promised by President Trump that things are going to turn around. And that is in regard to Israel and the United Nations Resolution 2334. And I'm sure that you're all familiar with it. It was an extraordinary betrayal of a faithful ally by the Obama administration in its last days. The UN has passed many similar resolutions over the years, condemning Israel for doing things that were perfectly legitimate in terms of Israel's right to self-defense and ownership of the land on which it is based, and the United States would always veto them. But, of course, as you all know, the United States did not veto this and allowed it to pass. It passed actually unanimously in the UN Security Council, a prohibition, a criminalization of any Israeli construction on any land that was won in the 1967 war. Now, that is an extraordinary document because it essentially is saying that the parts of Jerusalem that include the Temple Mount and the Western Wall actually are occupied Palestinian land. And this is in line with a UNESCO resolution from a few months ago that actually did say that said that the Temple Mount is Palestinian. It is not a Jewish site. Now, anybody who's been there and anybody who's studied any of the history of the region, or anybody who's opened a Bible, will know that there is no more Jewish site than the site of the Temple of Solomon and the previous temple. There is no more Jewish site than Jerusalem in general. And the United Nations is now on record declaring that those are not Jewish sites. They do not belong to Israel, and Israel is violating international law if it builds on those sites. This is an outrage to history, to reason, to truth, as well as to international law as it has previously been established in numerous ways. The whole of that area was marked out for Jewish settlement by the League of Nations after the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire in after World War I. Not only that, but the countries that Israel defeated in 1967 were all determined to destroy Israel utterly, and Israel took over those territories in order to protect itself and with a perfectly legitimate right of self-defense and of the right of conquest in wartime. The right of conquest in wartime is something that has been universally recognized for every country in the world, everywhere in history, all over the globe, except for Israel. Do you know since I started out talking about a philosopher, I'll mention another, the German philosopher from the 18th century, Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant was born and died in the German city of Königsberg, which was an ancient German city going back to medieval times. And he lived there all his life. He never left there. And oddly enough, because he was kind of an eccentric, he made part of his living giving travelogues, and they were very popular. People would come from all over to hear him describe various sites. Rome, the Vatican, Jerusalem, wherever. He had been all over, and he knew all about them, except he hadn't. He'd never been anywhere outside Königsberg. He just read books about them. And what if you wanted to go to Königsberg today? You can't. It does not exist. It is Kaliningrad in Russia. Why? Because Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union defeated him and took over a great deal of German territory. After World War II, it was assigned to Russia, to Poland, and to other states. Nobody raises a murmur of protest. There is no right that Germans have to claim Königsberg as a German city. Hitler was embarked on an evil scheme, and as evil as the Soviets were, they won that city fair and square. And they still hold it. Nobody would say a thing about it. And there are thousands, literally thousands of examples like that I could give you. But when it comes to Israel, suddenly that's off the table. When that is real international law, the United Nations has been around since 1945, but nations have been around since time immemorial. And that's always how things have been settled. What's more, of course, the 8-mile wide border at its slimmest extent that Israel would have without some of the lands from one in 1967 would essentially guarantee the eventual destruction of Israel. I mean, 8 miles that you have to defend. So one mistake and you're done for. And at least the country is bisected and dismembered and ultimately destroyed altogether. And so, President Trump, of course, isn't that nice to say? I like to say that, President Trump. 8 years I would always refer to Barack Obama. I never once referred to President Obama. Now you can say, oh no, Spencer, you're wrong because I read an article that you said President Obama. Some editor put that in. I never once wrote it or said it. But President Trump, doesn't that sound nice? And it's not that he's got an especially winning personality or a morally upright background. It's that he's actually doing things to defend the United States. And like I say, the sun is so bright. I'm blinking to try to see the reality of things. Now, it's very important that he keeps his word on this and repudiates that resolution and defends Israel at the UN, or if he, even better, defunds the UN and gets it out of America, then what we need to do in any case is very much strengthen that alliance and reaffirm our commitment to the safety and the continued existence of Israel. Now, this is not just a matter of loyalty to an ally, and not just a matter of doing what is right by any other nation, particularly one with which we are allied, but it's also an essential aspect of our defense against the global jihad. The war against Israel is a jihad. A jihad is a struggle to establish Islamic law over a land on which it is not yet established. That's what jihad is all about. It's not just about blowing things up for the fun of it. It's about destabilizing non-Muslim governments so that they ultimately fall and are replaced with Muslim governments, Islamic law governments. Israel, of course, in the Islamic view, has no right to exist and will never have any right to exist because of what is written in the Quran. So you would open your Qurans to chapter 2, verse 191. You didn't bring it? It's okay, I brought mine. I read the Quran so you don't have to. Chapter 2, verse 191 is one of the most charming verses in this most cuddly of books. Kill them whenever you find them, and drive them out from where they drove you out. It's very simple. Kill them wherever you find them, and drive them out from where they drove you out. Drive them out from where they drove you out is actually the key part of this for our purposes tonight. Drive them out from where they drove you out means that no land that has ever belonged to Muslims or been ruled by Muslims can ever legitimately, in the eyes of Islam, be ruled by non-Muslims. Drive them out from where they drove you out. It's a very simple principle. So see, if, for example, the Muslims had a caliphate in Spain and the non-Muslims drove them out, well then the Muslims have a responsibility before Allah, delineated in the Quran, commanded in the Quran, to drive out the non-Muslims from Spain and re-establish Islamic rule. And it's the same situation for Israel. And actually, when you read, Al-Qaeda in particular is exercised about Spain, but ISIS, the Islamic State, has also written about it. And it is a very high item on the jihadi wish list. They want to destroy Israel, and then they want to reconquer Spain. Because it's in the Quran. Drive them out from where they drove you out. It couldn't be simpler. This is Allah speaking to the Muslims. This is something they have to do in order to please Allah. So when there are Camp David Accords and Oslo Accords and roadmaps and everything else that has been attempted to try to bring peace between Israel and the Palestinians, they are all doomed to failure before they even start. And they will never, ever work. They will never bring peace because there will always be Muslims in that area who believe they have a responsibility before their God to drive them out from where they drove you out. And so what is the solution? The solution is only to be strong, to understand this, to unapologetically assert and insist that this is land that is the land of Israel, and be determined to defend it. But understand, this is not something that's going to be solved. Now, we want a solution. TV shows are 30 minutes long or an hour long, and we want it all to be wrapped up by the end. But there is just no solution to this problem. There's only management of it. And the only management of it can come from military, cultural, spiritual, societal strength. If any one of those is missing, then there's going to be trouble. And one of the reasons why we have so much trouble is that many of those elements have been missing in whole or part, on the part of many Israelis as well as on the part of the American left. And so the first key to any kind of solution for Israel in terms of any kind of way that it can continue to exist in safety and security is to understand that all these negotiations and peace efforts are the wrong way to go. Now, Donald Trump has not shown any indication of being aware of this, but he has shown a strong determination to defend Israel and to keep the jihadis from encroaching further upon it. But it was very disquieting when the other day it came out, a very strange statement from his press secretary that was one of the few sour notes and equivocal notes that we have heard from this White House since January 20th. And that was that it was sort of a strange thing. You remember it said, maybe those settlements aren't such a good idea. Maybe they are an obstacle to peace. And then it said the president is not intending to make here an official statement on the settlements. So that's good. We have a little bit of breathing room, but it was not a good sign. What the president, I hope, will do is look at the example of even recent history. 10 years ago, we were told that Gaza was in ferment and on fire because Israelis were there, establishing settlements, and it was Palestinian land. And the Israelis agreed, which they really never ought to do. And they left and forcibly dismantled those settlements. And the American publisher Mortimer Zuckerman spent $14 million to buy greenhouses that the Israelis had established in Gaza and gave them to the Palestinians so that they would be able to have gainful employ, have something to occupy their time. The idea was, Zuckerman clearly thought, and many, many other people clearly thought, that if the Israelis go, if they end the occupation, if they stop the settlement construction, then the Palestinians will be pacified, they will stop the war, they will go about their business, they will start to pursue peaceful occupations, and they have these greenhouses they can work in, they have other things they can do. What did they do? They immediately gutted the greenhouses and made them into weapons smuggling tunnels. The outpoint of many of the weapons smuggling tunnels from the Sinai was these greenhouses. And they only stepped up the jihad against Israel. It didn't lessen. They didn't stop fighting the Israelis. They started lobbing rockets into Israel, so that Israel has several times now had to go in to Gaza. And then immediately we always hear how disproportionate the Israeli response is and so on. There's nothing disproportionate about dealing with a people that wants to destroy you utterly. I am not in the slightest bit saying that the Palestinians should be destroyed utterly. But to take measures that appear to be harsh or are portrayed as harsh, and of course the grievance propaganda industry in Gaza is very strong and sophisticated and has continually been found to have manufactured atrocities by the IDF, and then they go out into the international news, and it's only much later we find out that the whole thing was fake. But in any case, reality is sometimes difficult. And this is a group, if you look at the Middle East Media Research Institute or Palestinian Media Watch, and you see what they see on TV all the time in Gaza, you would be amazed at the open calls for genocide of the Jews, the open anti-Semitism, the hatred and the venom that is so very deep. And it ultimately goes back to the Quran, which not only says drive them out from where they drove you out, but if you turn to chapter 5, verse 82, it says that the Jews among all people will be the worst enemies of the Muslims, which in practice generally works out to being that the Muslims are the most hostile to the Jews. And they see them as some sort of subhuman beasts that are deeply evil. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, the famous ex-Muslim feminist, grew up as Muslim in Somalia, and then later she emigrated to Europe and speaks about seeing Jews for the first time and being shocked and seeing they're just ordinary people. She thought they were sort of gargoyles in semi-human form, stalking around, doing evil on the earth. And this is what these people are told all the time exactly this kind of thing. If you look at the Quran's teaching on the Jews, it says that they are under a curse of Allah for claiming that Ezra is the son of God, which of course they don't. Chapter 9, verse 30 of the Quran. It says that humiliation and disgrace follows them wherever they are, which is chapter 2, verse 89. And this is something that becomes a responsibility incumbent upon the Muslims to make sure. If Jews are not living humiliated and disgraced, then the Muslims have to make sure that they are, because it's in the Quran. If humiliation and disgrace follow them wherever they are, then if they don't have it, it has to be brought upon them. They essentially are haters of Allah, haters of the good, the killers of the prophets, and the enemies of the Muslims that are most skillful and indefatigable and inveterate. Against this backdrop, if somebody's reading this book then as the eternal and perfect words of the one and only God, then how are you going to see some negotiated settlement? How are you going to see the existence of Israel at all? It has to be destroyed. And so it is good to see that we have a president now, for the first time in so very long, who is interested in defending Israel. I hope that people around him will be telling him some of these things so that we don't continue to waste our time on peace accords that are never going to do anything and have all too often been used to force concessions upon the Israelis that are dangerous for their own security and continued survival. But that instead we will devote our efforts and our resources to genuine steps that can defend Israel. The other thing, excuse me, the other thing that is, of course, very large in the news these days is the President Trump's immigration ban, his Muslim ban, as it's being called. 87% of the Muslims in the world are not affected by it. And yet it is being completely demonized and vilified as a Muslim ban. The people who prefer the shadows of Plato's cave to reality are ignoring some very important facts in trying to vilify this ban and get it done away with altogether. And of course, right now it's not in effect. A federal judge called for it to be halted, and then the Justice Department, President Trump's Justice Department, has challenged that ban and called for a stay on the ban of the ban. And they're going to be fighting about this for a long time. But though actually American law is quite explicit and very clear that the president has the right and the responsibility to make immigration restrictions of any kind without any kind of exception made in that law in order to safeguard the security of the American people. Now, is keeping people out from places like Yemen and Somalia a good idea? And does it have to do with national security, or is it just a racist, bigoted, anti-Muslim step that shows that the alt-right neo-Nazi white supremacists have taken over Washington and the sky is falling? We need to look at reality in order to answer that question. And it's really very simple. The Islamic State, as ISIS calls itself, you remember ISIS or ISIL as the former president used to call it? And the former president. And that group actually calls itself the Islamic State. Since June 29, 2014, has proclaimed itself to be the sole legitimate government for Muslims on earth, and indeed for non-Muslims, the Caliphate, the successor of Muhammad. The Caliph is the successor of Muhammad as the military, political, and spiritual leader of the Muslims. And this entity now occupies a large expanse of Iraq and Syria. At its highest point, it occupied a land larger than Great Britain. And it, because of its claim to be the Caliphate, which has been endorsed by many other Muslim groups, It also has allegiance of groups that hold significant expanses of land in Libya, in Nigeria, in Yemen, and elsewhere. It is an international movement, and it has declared war on the United States in no uncertain terms. In September 2014, it issued a lengthy fatwa, a religious ruling, explaining why it was the Muslims' duty to kill Americans and to kill others. It especially singled out what it called the spiteful and filthy French. And we saw again an attack at the Louvre in Paris just days ago. And it said that you are to kill Americans and kill other Western non-Muslims in any way that you can. Use an IED. If you don't have an IED, then shoot them. If you don't have a gun, then stab them. If you don't have a knife, run them over with your car. And we've seen a lot of that. There's been a lot of that in Israel as well. Now, this group, the Islamic State, in calling for the murders of American civilians, also made it very clear. In February 2015, it said, we are going to flood Europe with 500,000 refugees. They said it straight out. We're going to flood Europe with 500,000 refugees. Now, 500,000 refugees, what would that do to Europe? Well, we're seeing, because they came. What a coincidence. And what would they do to Europe? Well, first thing they would do is overwhelm the welfare systems of those welfare states, because they don't come and work. Because the Quran in chapter 9, verse 29, you can turn there, it says that Muslims must fight against the people of the book, who are primarily Jews and Christians, until they pay the jizya, a tax, with willing submission and feel themselves subdued, which is essentially saying that in the proper scheme of things, it's the responsibility of Jews and Christians to pay for the upkeep of the Muslims, to pay this tax that supports the Muslims. And so if the non-Muslims are not paying the tax, the Muslims have the right to take their resources by theft or to take advantage of their welfare systems and so on. So they're not working and they're overwhelming the welfare systems, but above all, they are engaging in all kinds of behavior that is creating tremendous upheaval in European societies. For one thing, in November 2015, Islamic jihadis attacked at several points in Paris and murdered 130 people. All of those attackers, it did not come out immediately, but it has now been established that every last one of those attackers was a refugee who had just come into Europe. And so you think about, well, the Islamic State said we're going to send refugees. They were going to embed jihadis among the refugees, and they have done so. Not only that, but the refugees have committed an absolute pandemic of rapes and sexual assaults. Now, this is very unpleasant, but it's all in the Quran. This is based upon the Quran. If you turn to chapter 4, verse 3, I don't know why you don't have it. I take mine wherever I go. Anyway, it says, marry the women that seem good to you, 2 or 3 or 4. And then it says, if you fear that you will not be able to treat them justly, then marry one, or from among those your right hands possess. Who are those your right hands possess? Well, I happen to have here, I like to carry this one around. You can see I've carried it around a lot, because this is a certified moderate Quran. And we need to empower the moderates. You've all heard that. And I was in London. I can't go there anymore because I committed the crime of saying that Islam has a doctrine of violence against unbelievers. Stay tuned to see if the Prime Minister of Great Britain will start banning people who say that water is wet. But in any case, I was in London a few years back, and I did what any American tourist would do in London. I toured the mosques. And so I was at the Finsbury Park Mosque, which was notorious a few years back. Abu Hamza was the imam there. He was a very notorious character. You may have seen pictures of him. He had, at one point, in an excess of piety, blown himself up. And he had lost his eye and both of his hands. So he had this strange white eye with no pupil and hooks for hands. And he was the imam at this mosque, and they preached jihad terror. He is now in prison in the United States for his part in a conspiracy to establish an Al-Qaeda training camp in Bly, Oregon. And anyway, Abu Hamza's gone now. He was gone when I went there. And I said to the very nice young man who was loading me up with books, hoping to convert me to Islam. It didn't work. And he was very friendly, very courteous. And I said, I hear you had some trouble here a few years back. And he said, yes, there were some extremists here, but they're all gone. And now we're all moderates. All of them. And so he gave me this moderate Quran. This Quran is a translation of the Arabic text with commentary by Sayyid Abu Allah Maududi. Maududi was a Pakistani Islamic scholar and politician. He was the founder of Jamaat-e-Islami, which is still the largest political party in Pakistan that wants to establish the fullness of Islamic law. Maududi died in 1979, and his works on the Quran, he wrote a multi-volume commentary on the Quran, of which this is a digest, and his works on the Quran, you can find it. Next time you go to your local Muslim bookstore, ask for books by Maududi. I guarantee you they will have them. He's not considered extremist. He's very mainstream. And so when you go in, remember Maududi. Anyway, I'm going to let him explain what the captives of the right hand, those whom your right hands possess, are. There are several other verses. I won't take your time to read them all, but there are several other verses relating to these people that it makes it clear that a Muslim man can have sexual relations with them even though he's not married to them. And this is what he says, Maududi. This expression, those whom your right hands possess, denotes slave girls, i.e. female captives of war, who are distributed by the state among individuals when no exchange of prisoners of war takes place. Now you may have heard ISIS doing this and kidnapping large numbers of Yazidi and Christian girls and using them in this way. And it's the same thing in Europe, where you also have the Quran verse, chapter 33, verse 59. You remember that one. I'm sure you have it needle pointed on your wall. It says, O Prophet, enjoin your wives and your daughters and the believing women to draw a part of their outer garments over them. It is likelier that they will be recognized and not molested. Recognized, that is, as Muslims, if they're all covered up, and not molested. So you see, the women who are not going to be molested have to be veiled, have to have their heads covered, their faces covered, whatever. But if you are not thus covered up, then you can be molested. That's the subtext here. That if you want to be molested, then don't dress in this way. Don't draw a part of your outer covering over them. So these Muslim guys come into Europe and they see these women who are not all veiled, and they think these are non-Muslim women. Non-Muslim women can be taken as captives of the right hand, and they're not veiled, so they can be molested. And so this is the rape epidemic in Germany, in Sweden. Sweden is now the rape capital of the world because of Muslim migrants. So President Trump, you remember, President Trump, he wants to keep this kind of thing from happening here. And one of the very sparsely reported but extraordinary aspects of his ban on these countries, and that's only a beginning. A lot of people say, well, wait a minute, why wasn't Saudi Arabia, why wasn't Afghanistan? Well, a lot of countries ought to be added to the list. And that's some good news that Reince Priebus, his chief of staff, did say recently that some countries may be added to the list. But first they have to establish that the list can be done at all, that we have any right to defend ourselves. But the extraordinary thing about the executive order is that it says that the United States should and must keep people out who want to put religious law over civil law, who want to have bring over practices such as honor killings and the violence against people who are of a different religion or violence against women. Now, of course, Islam justifies all those things. And so it was very clear what it was all about. And the idea that the United States could keep those people out and should keep those people out, it's very simple. It's either do that or face the kind of societal upheaval that we're seeing in Europe and will be seeing in Europe for years to come. Either we keep out some people who are legitimate travelers and will not cause any trouble, or we bring in people among whom will be an unknowable number of Islamic jihad mass murderers and people who believe in Islamic law to the extent that they will take women and molest them and go on welfare and never do any good for anybody, and they will cause immense disruption to American society. It's an either or. You either inconvenience some people who are perfectly nice folks, or we bring upon ourselves a future of mass murder and societal upheaval. Now you say, well, that's an oversimplification. Well, is it really? Yes, because you can vet the refugees, and even President Trump has said, we're going to do extreme vetting. I don't know what that means. It sounds good, though. And the only problem about it is that, and I think this ultimately is going to have to be faced by Trump or some future American president, how are you going to vet these people? Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, said, war is deceit, and gave permission to lie if a husband needs to lie to his wife to keep the marriage smooth. No, honey, I wasn't out with the captives of the right hand last night. And in wartime. And of course, the Islamic State and other jihadi entities consider themselves to be at war with the United States. So war is deceit. So how can you vet for people if they're going to lie, no matter what question you ask them? Not only that, but we've already seen the failure of the Obama vetting process. Tashfeen Malik, one of the San Bernardino shooters who killed 15 people at a Christmas party on December 2nd, 2015, she had passed 5 separate background checks from 5 different U.S. agencies. Now, this doesn't mean that nothing can be done. I think that if you did have some kind of questioning regarding support for Israel, regarding the attitudes toward women, toward honor killings, toward some of the things that were enumerated in the executive order, if they were properly phrased and administered by people who were knowledgeable, then they might be very revealing. Because even the most practiced deceiver, and the Quran tells us that Allah is the best of schemers, even the most practiced deceiver cannot cover for things he's not prepared to lie about. And so if the questions were cleverly enough crafted, there may be something that could be done. But in any case, in the short term, is a moratorium justified? It's obviously quite justified by law, justified by necessity, justified by the statements of the jihad entities, justified by the record of what's happened in Europe, justified by the teachings of Islam in regard to not only the things that I've enumerated already, but also the concept of, I'm 13 years old, the concept of emigration in general. Emigration, moving from one land to another, is actually central in Islam. It's a central Islamic concept. It's not tangential or incidental. It is central. As a matter of fact, the Islamic calendar, do you know what the year 1 of the Islamic calendar is? The Hijra. It's not when Muhammad was born. It's not when Muhammad died. It's not when Muhammad became a prophet. It's the Hijra. The Hijra is the emigration, when Muhammad moved from Mecca to Medina and became for the first time a military and political leader as well as a spiritual one. And so the idea of making that year 1 in the Islamic calendar is tacitly saying Islam is not really Islam until it's political and military and not just religious. That's one point. But it's also established as being political and military by means of emigration. Chapter 4, verse 100 of the Quran says, He who emigrates in the way of Allah will find in the earth enough room for refuge and plentiful resources, and he who goes forth from his house as a migrant in the way of Allah and his messenger, and whom death overtakes, his reward becomes incumbent on Allah. Now in the Quran, in Islam, there's no savior, there's no redemption, they're just the scales. If your good deeds outweigh your bad deeds, you go to paradise. If your bad deeds outweigh your good deeds, you go to hell. And so when there's something that's promised a reward from Allah, that's extremely important, because that's a big thing on your good deed scale, to emigrate in the way of Allah. But emigrating in the way of Allah does not mean moving to the United States to get a good job and send money back to Pakistan. Moving in the way of Allah, emigrating in the way of Allah, means you are bringing Islam to the new place. That's what it's all about. And that means everything that it means. The subjugation of the infidels, the subjugation of women, the extinguishing of the freedom of speech, the honor violence, much more. If you bring that to a new land, you will be rewarded by Allah. Now, do any Muslims take this seriously in the United States? I will close with one example. A few years back, there was a school in Minnesota called the Tariq ibn Zayed Academy. It was a charter school, which means it received federal funds, and yet it was essentially an Islamic school. All the students were Muslims, they had Quran class, they had prayers, and so eventually a controversy began, because of course the prayer in school is supposed to be not allowed, and religious schools are not supposed to receive government funding. This has all been established vis-a-vis Christianity over the years, and so this school was challenged, and ultimately it was shut down, and ultimately it reopened in the same place under another name and is doing the same things, but that's another story. The point I am making here is that in all that controversy about Tariq ibn Zayed Academy, I did not see one story where one reporter had the wit or curiosity to ask someone there, hey, who's Tariq ibn Zayed? Is he the John Dewey of Islam, some great educator? Tariq ibn Zayed was one of the conquerors of Spain. And he's famous for landing on the beach in Spain and ordering the boats burned. And his soldiers said, what are you doing burning the boats? And he said, we're here to stay. We either die here or we establish Islam here, but we ain't going back. Now, what do you think the people in Minnesota who thought, hey, let's call it Tariq ibn Zayed Academy, what do you think they have in mind? So, it's extraordinary the times we're living in. And I think it's going to be very difficult. Obviously, there's no doubt it's going to be very difficult. But for the first time in so many years, we have pushback, actual attempts to defend Americans against the global jihad. And I don't mean just 8 years, I mean quite a bit longer than that. President Trump is more honest when he speaks, even when he says the words radical Islamic terrorism. President Trump is more honest about the nature, the motivating ideology of the jihad threat than any president since John Quincy Adams. And John Quincy was not a candidate in 2016. So what's happened now is extraordinary. The move toward globalization, the erasure of national boundaries, the erasure of ethnic distinctions, and the establishment of a socialist internationalist order was just moving along swimmingly. And now suddenly a wrench has been thrown in the works. The people who love that machine, the people who love the shadows, they are clearly very riled up, and they're going to keep coming. But remember, the first rule always in confronting bullies, confronting evil, stand up to them. If you stand up and refuse to cede an inch, then they're the real cowards. They will run away. And ultimately, I think that, I'm more optimistic than I've been in years. We have a chance to prevail and preserve free societies now. But we all have to work and recognize that it's not all just going to be handed to us now that we have a president who has a modicum of sense. and is not a globalist determined to destroy nation states and so on. We have to work harder than ever to make sure that the forces of oppression, the forces of darkness, are not going to prevail after all. And are not going to make this just a wonderful interlude before it's back to the cave. We will never go back to the cave again. Thank you.